So thank you to everyone who joined us on YouTube and Facebook and the Van Leer Institute website. Welcome to another event of the Polonsky Salon. Polonsky Salon is a series of online events hosted by postdoctoral fellows at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, like myself. Salon events are made to share inspiring and groundbreaking works by scholars from all over the world. The mission of this series is to celebrate new and daring and creative books in the humanities and social sciences. The Van Leer Jerusalem Institute is dedicated to the social impact of deep ideas. And not many books fit this vision as well as this book that we will discuss today. Diet for a Large Planet is a book that brings forward some of the most pressing issues of our time, the environmental crisis and the failures of the food system, and positions them in this deep humanistic ideas about history. Hi, my name is Alma Igra. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, and I'm a historian of science and food and internationalism. And I'm very excited to introduce Chris Otter and the book we will discuss today. Chris Otter is a professor at The Ohio State University who focuses on history of science, technology, and environment. His research is primarily concerned with, but not limited to, as we will discuss today, 18th and 19th century Britain. His first book, The Victorian Eye, presented the link between technology, vision, and power in the Victorian era. His second book, which we will discuss today, is titled Diet for a Large Planet: Industrial Britain, Food Systems, and World Ecology. The book came out with Chicago in 2020 and immediately steered a lot of conversations between historians and scholars in the environmental humanities, but also among food activists and people who care about justice in the food system. Professor Otter has received numerous awards and honors, so I don't want to go over all of them right now, but I do want to mention that the book won the highly prestigious Bentley Prize from the AHA, the American Historical Association, and that his new project that deals with the Technosphere is supported by the Guggenheim Fellowship. I also want to highlight something if I'm already presenting Chris's intellectual profile, which is his very unique ability to write good state-of-the-field essays. And I think that the ability to put together different kinds of conversations and map them together is so essential to the study of the food systems. So I just want to mention that, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. Sometimes you need to even force a conversation between different realms of reality to talk about the food system. So in the meanwhile, thank you, Chris, for joining us this evening. It's an honor to have you and talk about this book. And I want to start with a very simple, very complicated question. Chris, what is a diet for a large planet, and when was it created?
Well, first of all, Alma, thank you so much for inviting me to this salon. I'm sitting in Columbus. It's midday our time. I know it's midday because the tornado siren has just been tested. So I know we're right on time here. Very simply put, the diet for a large planet that I describe in this book is a product of what I call large planet thinking. And this is basically the idea that the entire planet can be used for resources and for capital investment. There's no physical limit. The physical limits to capitalism and the physical limits to the systems through which you extract resources are limited only by the planet and the planetary. So this means that the entire planet is taken as a resource. Distance is no object. And the diet for a large planet then is Britain taking its large planet thinking and using the planet as a food resource, most notably for meat, wheat, and sugar, as I talk about in the book. And this took place over the long 19th century.
So you said that part of it is a thinking process. And if I can follow up on that, the shift is really in your book, not just an industrial shift. It's not about the technology that enables us to, ship food all over the world. It's not about big supermarkets. It's not just the industry. It's really a conceptual shift. And I think that you link in your book a lot of the classical political economists like Smith and Ricardo, and you basically let us look at them through their dinner plates, which I really liked. Part of it is that maybe they could not even imagine capitalism, the liberal visions that they had of the economy, had they not ate big planet diets. Can you talk a little bit about the free market and why is the free market related to food? You know, I was thinking to myself, is the free market actually free food market, essentially?
That's a great question. And so just to sort of put it a bit of context, when we talk about economics in the period sort of 1770 to 1850, we use the expression political economy. So there are a series of political economists who write on the very issues that we're talking about here today. Where should we get food from? We're an industrializing nation. More land is being given over to industry and so forth. But we are largely self-sufficient in food. So how did people start to think about not being self-sufficient in food? Well, in the late 18th century, some of the biggest thinkers were adamant that we should remain self-sufficient in food, notably Thomas Malthus, who was extremely skeptical of the idea of bringing in food from elsewhere. Why were people so skeptical about this? Well, there were really two reasons. First of all, this is a country ruled by an agrarian class, and an agrarian class that makes its money from farming. So the idea here is that if cheap food is coming in from outside, farming and the landed interest is going to lose money. There's also a security element. This is during war with Napoleon. The idea of like importing food means you're at the mercy potentially of enemies. And so it was seen as a security problem, but also a way of upholding the order, the sort of natural order, almost a feudal order, you might say, that still persisted. And so in the late 18th century, early 19th century, many authors take this traditional line, and people are thinking about ways that it might be possible to intensify British agriculture, to make British agriculture more intensive, more small planet. But a new strain of political economy, which you can connect to Smith, although Smith is a bit ambivalent. Smith was aware of some of the problems, I think, of outsourcing. But you can see this really emerging in someone like Ricardo, who has this idea of comparative advantage, which basically says that every part of the world should make what it's best at and make what it can make most cheaply in terms of the world market. The argument being here then is if you can get food from overseas for cheaper than what you can get it domestically, then we should import this, because this is good for the economy. In a sense, it's good for industry, because they don't need to pay their workers quite so much if food prices come down. So the idea here is to sort of make food cheaper, make its prices lower. This is comparative advantage, and it's all to everyone's advantage in this political economy dream where Britain's busy making like knives and guns and stuff, and Argentina is busy with meat and so forth. If everybody does their thing, then the global economy will work as one wondrous, fantastic, fabulous whole to the benefit of all, which of course didn't happen. It's clearly linked also to Britain's growing empire and growing sea power. You know, you can do a large planet diet when you control large swathes of the planet's surface, and you've helpfully got rid of their first peoples, which is also what happens here. So this is how the diet for a large planet model evolved, and I'd say that it becomes really hegemonic by 1850. So the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846, and then we start getting the end of things like sugar taxes, and then you really have a genuinely free market in food, no protection whatsoever. It's astonishing, and historically very rare. And so this is what Britain dived into in the 50s and 60s.
And I think that it's more than other commodities. You know, kind of food created the model for other commodities to make the world, as you said, capitalism with no limits, right? Capitalism with no, like everything is imaginable, and everything could be produced in one place and consumed in another. But food really worked in this way, that not all commodities did.
Right.
And somehow, I mean, in my opinion, if we kind of reconstruct some of the food in the story of economy, we have a more complicated story on really what is economy today. I mean, I've been
Right.
thinking a lot about the connection between food and money, not just in the way that we use money to buy food. And when people don't have money, they sometimes can't afford food, because there are all other sorts of connections in the way they were regulated, historically. So in my research, part of it is the League of Nations and all of these ways in which when we regulate the economy, we sometimes regulate food. And then when we force food back to the story, we see the ways in which food is also not like money.
Right,
You
right,
can't
right,
have the deficit, and you can't,
right.
it just works differently. You can't really always convert. The banks of food fail more often. And anyways, I was thinking about this a little bit in the context of how the links between food and money became very tangible to me in this framing of the thinking about large planet and how it worked. So the book opens with 3 chapters on meat, wheat, and sugar. These are the 3 food products that you kind of shape in the middle of the entire conversation. We have the meat, wheat, sugar complex. Can you talk a little bit on what is the meat, wheat, sugar complex and how it shaped the world? Why is it meat, wheat, sugar, and how they change the way we eat?
Right. I'll actually quickly go to your question, a little musings on food and money, because I think it's very interesting when talking about wheat, which is a central commodity in this process. It was one foodstuff that was frequently interconvertible with banknotes or loan, or you could take in America, you could take wheat and exchange it for warehouse receipts, which could then be collateral for bank loans. Wheat is very durable and storable. It can be very accumulated and exchanged. James C. Scott writes about this in sort of much earlier times. And one commentator actually noted that wheat was really the only competitor to the gold standard at one point. It had to be reliable, and it was made reliable through standardization. Particularly Canadian wheat became the gold standard of wheat because it was so predictably strong in terms of its gluten content. But wheat, of course, is also not like money. You can't use flour as money because once it's ground into flour, it's far less durable and it can't serve as de facto money. And wheat itself will rot, unlike gold. Nevertheless, I think wheat approaches this idea of food as money more closely than meat and sugar. And so when I talk about the meat, wheat, sugar complex, you're talking here about 70 to 80% of the calories consumed by an average British person. And all of the sugar comes from overseas until the first dabblings with sugar beet in the 19th century, which are mere pinpricks here. By 1914, 80% of Britain's wheat is imported, and somewhat less, probably 40% of Britain's meat is imported, but it's particularly high in terms of things like bacon and lamb being imported. These are world markets. These are also technological systems. So if you want to just break them down individually, the wheat complex that we started by talking about was really a complex which focuses its interest upon anywhere that can produce cheap wheat, but where it's really put into action is in North America. And we see the conversion of the Great Plains and the Canadian prairies into gigantic wheat fields. It opens up the US West completely. It requires multiple components. So it requires things like railways, it requires grain elevators, it requires inspectors, and it also needs wheat. And it doesn't just need any old wheat, it needs wheat you could turn into the kind of loaf that the British working classes like to eat. The loaf that the British working classes were increasingly turning to was a big fluffy white loaf, which needed high gluten flour, which actually ironically couldn't be grown in Britain. You can use British wheat for things like sort of scones and puddings and pies, but not for the loaf. And so there was actually wheat breeding to engineer for different varieties, different breeds of wheat, notably Red Fife and Marquis. And these were sort of two massively popular and hugely profitable wheat breeds. that were created through selective and controlled breeding and then enter into the system. Similar story with meat, but we're talking about somewhat different parts of the world, and we're talking about slightly different technologies. So the meat complex also includes the United States, but it's particularly focused on Argentina and also on Denmark for bacon, and on New Zealand and Australia for lamb and sheep. You need vast pastures. Huge amounts of the Earth's surface is taken up with both livestock and the food that feeds the livestock. This is when we sort of talk about how there's a competition between human and animal for resources. This is where we really start to see it with full evidence. Now, this technological complex requires slaughterhouses, and it requires slaughterhouses that go quickly because there's an increasing amount of animals being produced there or being reduced there. We also have here refrigeration technologies, steamships, butcher shops, and again, we have living material. And it's important to go right down into the living material here. The cattle breeds that were being produced for meat by the late 19th, early 20th century on a global scale were all British breeds that have been taken overseas and sort of prime stocks of British beef, Aberdeen, Angus, and Hereford, particularly in North and South America, when there were actually cattle extant in North America. The Spanish had brought them over, but these did not suit the British market. British market wanted a nice lump of fat around the outside and animals that you could fatten quickly. And it's through new feeding regimens that you're able to make animals, cattle, grow really quickly. So people start to talk about baby beef, which is beef that's like under 2 years old. It's been bred and then fed to fatten from birth. This makes the whole system more quickly. It culminates in the chicken complex of the 20th century, 21st century, where chickens live for 42 days. And that's about the limit that we seem to have reached here. The other point about this is the food miles, is that in New Zealand, where Britain exported sheep, and it also exported grass and various other forms of foliage, then they created breeds of sheep that were really well suited to New Zealand's climate. This is the Corriedale and the Romney. And then they slaughtered them and shipped the meat back to Britain, which is almost exactly antipodean to Britain. It's about as long as the longest distance of food miles you could possibly imagine. And the idea that this was done with no hesitation and no concern about the resources being used in order to do this, I think indicates how deep the large planet philosophy ran. And this has become very normal to us today, but it wasn't very normal in, say, 1880. Sugar is a little bit different. Do you want to come in there, or do you want me to go on?
Yeah, I just want to, we'll get to sugar in a minute. I wanted to say that the question of competition really stays deep into the 20th century and the times I'm writing about, the competition between men and between the meat and what you feed the meat, which is not, which is grains mostly. So your meat is eating not your wheat, but your meat is eating your grains. And that's a constant competition, which also, again, is just an interesting way in which economic thinking comes in, because they write about cows and they write about the animals as some sort of converters. They convert grains into protein. This is a new way of banking with the animal body, which I find so interesting. And of course, like all banks, they fail, right? But maybe they're not unique in that. But I just wanted to kind of reiterate that this is part of how the economics comes into it again. And just the term food miles, I just wanted to say that this is a term that we use to calculate how far the food traveled. And I mean, it was coined by a British scholar, and maybe it's not surprising, but I just wanted to kind of put that because, this is because I want the different terms from the conversation to be clear to everybody who joined us. But the question of food miles, we're now already, I find it difficult for us to imagine how good large planet was in the eyes of many people. Because now if you go into a supermarket, it's all about, oh, this is local and this is from this place and that's from that place. I mean, even though we don't really follow that, I think it really penetrated the marketing systems, even if not the actual markets, but it really is about, I think that now small planet diets became so trendy that we really need to remember that, they don't really exist. Most people still eat large planet. And also B, there was a time once upon a time, and it's not very far back in the past, that it was completely desirable and good to advocate for food to travel as much as possible.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I just wanted to kind of mention that. But let's go back to sugar then. So we have meat, we have wheat. We talked a little bit about the relationships between grains and protein or meat, where sugar fits in this.
Okay, just quickly before sugar, I just want to follow up on one thing you said. The British public had to be educated to eat large planet food. So, for example, with lamb bought from New Zealand, there were sort of one ruse was to call it Canterbury lamb. It actually came from Canterbury, New Zealand, but people thought it was from Canterbury, England, so that it was local and sort of home grown. The idea of meat being outsourced, I think, was a little bit more troubling. And also, people had to be educated to eat frozen meat. There's all kinds of debates over frozen or even chilled meat being less tasty than its British ancestor or its British competitor. So back to sugar. Sugar's a rather different story. In some ways, sugar is the original large planet food, directly entwined with slavery and European colonialism from the early modern period onwards. Now, what we do see in the history of sugar is, again, this sort of sense of like apparatus, milling, and then refining. The sugar was always brought back to Europe to be refined. Those Dutch refineries and British refineries making a killing off refining sugar, they're obviously refining sugar that's been brought from sugar cane. Now, with the early 19th century abolition of slavery and the slave trade and so forth, there's a sort of decline of the Caribbean as being the major source for sugar cane and a rise of places like Java and South Africa. So basically anyone who produces sugar globally can flood the British market, keep the price low. This is something that happens in the 1850s in particular, when sugar really floods in and starts really becoming interlaced with British diet, sugary tea, cakes, and so on. But also Europeans were experimenting with sugar beets. And this is a kind of an interesting story where in the late 18th century, certain kind of mutant beets that were kind of white and strange, but had a higher sugar content, were bred and bred and bred again. And certainly from the early 19th century, Napoleon was really into this. Central Europeans liked the idea of growing their own sugar, and sugar beet became a major industry. And because, of course, Britain didn't mind where its sugar came from, the biggest importer of sugar into Britain by World War I was, I think, Germany. And this is sugar beet rather than sugar cane. And there's even a British sugar beet industry develops. And it's worth noting that for the large planet people, for the old Manchester political economists, the idea of creating and having to protect a sugar beet industry when you've got all this cheap sugar coming from over the world was seen as the height of economic madness, like ludicrous autarkic thinking. So sugar beet has always remained a fairly minor quantity. It gives a fairly minor quantity of food for the British.
And sugar is also different, maybe because it's more addictive than other commodities. I've been thinking about, the colonial commodities that are highly addictive, like sugar and tea and coffee, and I mean all sorts of ways in which historians are so we think so much about agency and the agency of different imperial committees and agency of different companies that traded these commodities. But then part of me was thinking about, like, when you're highly addicted to something, it's not exactly your own agency. I mean, it really makes these it really blurs the lines a little bit of agency in the story of commodity trade. And that, to me, this is something about sugar that makes it a little different, I think, in this context.
I think, sugar's seen as I know there are people who promote sugar as being the ultimate cure for fatigue. Sidney Mintz, in his famous work on sugar, actually uses the word addicted, I think, at one point in the book to describe how British workers, they have their tea break and they have a large impulse of sugar, and people measure the various spikes in blood sugar after people consume. So it's all part of a wider thing that's been called the psychotropic revolution, which also includes not just coffee and tobacco and snuff and chocolate, all these different kind of drugs that humans start to take, and that coincides with the rise of distillation, so you get stronger alcohol. This is all sort of 17th, 18th century. But more and more people are living a life where they're actually consciously or unconsciously consuming something for an immediate kind of mental effect, like for being alert or for being tired, in the case of alcohol.
Yeah. There is one, I want to say one more thing about the meat, wheat, sugar, and then we can move on. But what about other animal-based commodities? So you wrote something about milk, but I want to ask you, why wasn't it part of this book?
Right.
Isn't milk part of the big planet? And if not, why?
Yeah, milk is, but in a different way. And the story here is a fairly simple one, is that the original manuscript had a milk chapter, but the book was getting too big. And I had to cut the chapter, and I cut the milk chapter simply because milk it both is and isn't a large planet food. And I'll explain that here. The history of milk and milk consumption, of both liquid milk in particular, up to the 19th century is a history of a fairly low consumption in Britain. Milk was more often consumed as cheese because it becomes kind of durable and portable when we do this. So the domestic production of milk remains important. But we see some of the things that we've seen in the case of meat. So we see like the rise of the Frisian Holstein cow as the supreme milk producer, able to produce, and its body architecture has been selected and trained to deliver amounts of milk that were unseen in previous centuries. So we've got this kind of machinated cow sitting at the middle of the process. We need refrigeration and railways to bring this to cities. What we see is rising milk consumption in British cities, but falling milk consumption in a lot of rural areas where the milk was actually made. So this, again, is another way in which the food system centering on cities. But the other part of the story is the history of cheese and the history of butter and the history of condensed milk and the history of margarine, because these products are increasingly outsourced. So milk products. So, for example, this is the age of anemic, tasteless, globalized, homogenous cheddar, coming from Canada and New Zealand, designed for the British market, or maybe a bit of colouring thrown in there. This is also the age of condensed milk coming from the Netherlands. And this is also the age of good quality butter coming from Denmark and also Ireland. So it's a mixed bag. One part fits the large planet model, one part doesn't. But even then, there's this clear spatial difference between the way milk was produced in the early 20th century and the way it was produced in the 18th century.
And I think that maybe it was also regulated differently.
Yeah.
The protection and the laws related to milk and milk purity and kind of, the legal aspects of milk, I think, had a little bit of different, Yeah,
I mean, milk was potentially deadly. The tuberculosis and tuberculosis in particular, but also I think typhoid and various other waterborne diseases can enter into the milk supply, particularly if the milk supply wasn't very hygienic, which it very often wasn't. So there's serious concerns about this and worries about how this would impact infant mortality. And in fact, infant mortality remains stubbornly high at the start of the 19th century start of the 20th century. And that is largely, well, not largely, but it's certainly partly because of infections from milk.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when people teach history of food laws and food and legal systems, milk is sometimes the beginning of it, really,
right?
Because of these different diseases and the impact of milk and how dangerous this drink was, really.
Right. I think I want a quick word on eggs as well. The history of eggs is a kind of reverse history in terms of where eggs come from. Eggs were hugely imported in the 19th century. Remarkably large numbers, about half, came from Russia. There was a trade in Russian eggs with Britain. The domestic egg industry in Britain really develops in the 20th century with the use of the Rhode Island chicken and the development of battery farming, which was pioneered in the 1920s in northern England in a place called the Fylde near Preston. This is where you get your chickens and you heavily sort of contain them and basically stimulate them with electric lights and then force them to lay vastly more eggs than they're actually naturally able to do so. We go from around 12 eggs a year to around 300 eggs a year. And this becomes a national industry. So Britain becomes very self-sufficient in eggs, but it also uses some of this technology, biotechnology that's central to the large planet diet by making chickens into uber producers of eggs.
And all of this changes with World War I in your book. It's just astonishing. I mean, I felt like it's a really big, you really describe it as like the moment of shift, World War I and also World War II. All of a sudden, big planet diets are no longer desirable. Now there's a different plan. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? What World War I does to the large diet planet?
Right. Well, as the concerns about European war were growing in the late 19th and early 20th century, the issue of food became pressing, because if 80% of your wheat's coming from overseas and wheat is the sort of basis of your entire diet, then there would appear to be a problem. Germany is desperate to try and crack the nitrate fertilizer problem because it doesn't have the kind of global system that Britain does. And actually, Britain entered World War I thinking that its large planet system would work. There really hadn't been much attempt to kind of load up and stockpile food before the war. Of course, what happened was within 2 years, it was clear the system was failing, or not necessarily failing, but it was not achieving the kind of level of feeding that Britain wanted. And this is because it's pretty hard work defending convoys of ships coming across the Atlantic. The U-boat has changed the game considerably. So after about 1916, there was a move towards rationing and a move towards domestic production, and a move towards domestic production of anything and everything you possibly could use. So in other words, a total reversal of the policy. And this is totally state regulated. The state basically takes over the economy, takes over the way food moves. And Britain gets through the war really in terms of its food supply very, very successfully. And Germany doesn't. And that's not an accident, because Britain's blockading them. And one of the results here is that we end up, Germany ends up with tremendous food deprivation, starvation after World War I, which is partly a consequence of the British blockade.
We'll talk about the blockade in a second, because it it was my next question. But I also want to say that there is something about this shift that really felt powerful to me when I read the book. Because when you read it, so you have a chapter in the book about violence, and we'll talk about this in a second. but the entire book is about violence. I mean, that was one of the things I was thinking when I read it. You don't need a chapter. Everything is violent. I mean, the way you describe the biology of it, the use of animals, the history of people who worked in food production and agriculture, the land use, the people who were displaced. I mean, all of modern food system is violent in so many ways. And then you still have a chapter about violence. And we should talk about it in a second. But I think that in this moment where we're facing different issues of the failure of the food system and the violence of it, and the ways in which it's completely not sustainable, and when we're looking at it, it's impossible for us to imagine a moment of shift. But yet we had in history moments of shift from the big planet food philosophy. And I find some hope in that. I mean, as much as one could be, optimistic when reading about World War I, but the optimism is that really policies can change. And I saw it in different commodities, so not just in food, but in pharmaceutical production. I mean, it all becomes about, okay, we need to produce locally. And once there's enough interest in that of different stakeholders, actually local production does become a thing in medicine and in food. So I just wanted to kind of say that this was a moment of hope, in a sense that different changes could be made. Right. And anyways, let's talk now about the violence, right? So the whole book is violence. Why do we have a chapter about violence? And then what we have in it, I found, is different than what I expected, because it was mostly about the violence between people and not people and the earth or people and animals. So let's talk a little bit about violence. What does violence does for the food system, and what does it do in this book?
Right. I mean, violence works on many levels. There's a lot of, violence towards the earth is tackled in the chapter on earth, I suppose, and violence towards animals is tackled in the chapter on meat. And you might even think about violence towards sugar and violence towards wheat as well. So here, the story in this particular chapter is really about food and power, and command over food and what it does for imperial power. And if we follow this through, the real origins of this you see with sort of domestic removal of first peoples. So, for example, the Highland clearances in the 18th century results in a lot of people moving to Australia. This is done for the purposes of using the land for agriculture. And wherever the British used overseas land as a source of food, people had to be moved. So you can see that, for example, in Australia and New Zealand, we have example of the Tasmanians being wiped out. This is for farming. The Canadian Métis are crushed in the 1885 Northwest Rebellion. Of course, US native populations are relocated so we can have things like vast farms producing foodstuffs to be sent often to Britain. And in Argentina as well, gauchos, Patagonians are thrown off the land. So what we see across the world, I mean, tea in Assam too, everywhere the British go, there is violence. There is violence. It's the violent replacement of first peoples and earlier modes of agriculture that were often mistaken for being just nature. They weren't, are overthrown and replaced by Britain and the sure sign of British people, which was the fence. Wherever they went, they fenced their land in, and they fenced their cattle in, and they fenced their crops in. And this is building on John Locke's argument about what property actually was, which is if you don't improve your land, you don't own it. And this was a line that the British had throughout this period, so that they could see themselves as throwing people off the land. And this related to this process is a second form of violence, the most obvious form of human-on-human violence, which is famine. Here I use,
and this is the heart of the argument of violence. Right.
Rob Nixon's slow violence is used by a lot of people, but it really does apply to famine. Ireland is the only country in Europe that has a lower population today than it did in 1840. This is a direct result of several millions dying and leaving, fleeing where the population was cut from maybe around 8.5 million to maybe around 4 million. Now, if you read British political economists before the famine, they're saying these things about the Irish. There's too many people there. This has to be land used for our butter and beef. There is a redundant population there. These are the awful metaphors that we use, unnecessary mouths and so forth. So well before the famine, the political economists were already looking forward to a moment when Ireland had fewer people and more butter and beef and grain. Now, there was massive critique of the potato. Potato was seen as the antithesis of wheat. It was a lazy crop. You didn't need to do much tending for it. It was not a large planet food. You couldn't make enormous profits from it. You couldn't store it for a long period of time. It took no skill to make. Grain, meanwhile, encouraged work and thrift and so forth. So as well as the Irish being Catholics, they were potato eaters. And sometimes they're even imagined as being human potatoes. Now, when the famine broke out, it was its direct cause is potato blights, but this was an opportunity for the British political economists to get their wishes. Famine provided the opportunity to thin the population, and studies suggest that dehumanization is often a potent cause. The Catholic Irish had been dehumanized and potatoized for centuries, for decades, and as Marx said, Ireland was thus turned into an English agricultural district. And it still lives with that legacy today. And of course, the second and third chapters of this happen in India in the later 19th century and in the Bengal famine of 1943 to 1945. These again were sort of natural events such as drought, but the famine itself was created by the British policy, which was again the application of rigorous and heartless political economy. Which made sure that people had to enter camps and had to work before they got food, which leads to a disaster where millions more were forced to labor for food. Again, the idea that free food could not be given. Like there's no such thing as free food. It's everything is commoditized. So there are two parts of the violence equation. And then the next parts of it is something we've talked about already, which is wartime. But I just sort of take this a little bit further here. Post-World War I, Britain sort of tries to return to its pre-war economy, but it kind of peters out by the 1930s when really there is protection everywhere in the earth. The free wheat market is over, and actually the wheat market is the wheat protection is reintroduced around 1931. There are anxieties now over what's going to happen with the Second War. And of course, this is partly because World War I blockade of Germany caused lasting trauma in Germany. And Hitler's visions of dominion over Eastern Europe and the Ukraine came from a desire never to repeat World War I. Germany would never starve again. But it's not a large planet vision. It's contiguous land. The fascism encourages domestic production, but this will be domestic production in conquered land adjacent to Germany, and it will be sugar beet, rye bread, pork, territorially bounded. Fascists also generally went for brown bread by this point in time. Interestingly enough, they went for organic farming as well. So, food, violence, global consequences. I think I've laid those things out there particularly in terms of famine and of war.
And it's really how all of these events in which people starved were a combination of policy and biology, or policy and bodies, policy and agriculture. And I think that you really made it clear. And then also the power that food had as a weapon. And I mean, so you mentioned the 1930s. I think that the interwar really works in a weird way in that regard of violence in the food system, because you see, I mean, in my opinion, it's the point in which people speak in two voices on should we go back to the biggest large planet diets, or are we more invested in regulation? Are we invested in the research of food? There are all of these different committees on the study of nutrition, and these bodies I look at. And I think that part of what I saw in the 20th century is that the food is like the opposite of violence for some of these organizations. So the FAO, okay, this is post World War II, but when the UN starts the Food and Agriculture Organization, they really come out with all of these like utopic ideas about how food is the end of war. And
Right.
that's completely antithetical to everything in your book, basically, because
Right.
food is a story of violence. And I thought that this is something that I really learned from this book and saw it in a new light on how there is something ironic about the way people wrote about food in the 50s. And it's also a change of some of the narrative that historians had, because some of the narratives we have on industrial food are actually post-World War II. So your book really brings it all back, and also to Britain and not the US. So this is one of the ways in which the book intervenes in the field and changed it, and also helps us think about the 50s then in a different way, right? In a more critical way, in this Anglo-American relationship. Anyways, I want to say one more thing about, well, maybe it circles us back to the meat chapter, but it is related to violence, because we have, so you mentioned slow violence, and we have all sorts of invisible violence. And this is also, so you wrote a book about visibility, and I think that it speaks to this theme in an interesting way, how people eat more and more meat, and they eat food that involves all sorts of really new scales of violence, and then they're less and less aware of it. So there is this, I think that this was in the meat chapter actually, but there's this hyper masculine, powerful meat eating man. And this man is completely powerless if you consider the fact that he doesn't know what his meat is, and kind of how it was created. So this is, again, in the theme of violence. I find it quite big in the book, this question of people not being aware of where the food came from, and how food becomes more mysterious and invisible to us.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I think, as I wrote in the first book, there are a series of practices and activities that over the course of the 19th century became visually incompatible with what might be called a civilized urban space. And so one of these is slaughter. If you any city in England or in France, you could easily go and watch animals being slaughtered, because they were slaughtered in small houses. Often it was possible to sort of peek in and take a look at what was going on as animals were being slaughtered. And this was suddenly seen as a kind of, very demoralizing.
Yeah.
We don't want our kids seeing this kind of slaughter happening. Maybe they're going to turn into slaughterers themselves. So there was a definite sense of it being demoralizing. On the other hand, it's at precisely this moment when meat is being heralded as the source of vital power for the all-conquering Anglo-Saxon. And so how do you reconcile that? You make it really hidden. So you take it away from these little slaughterhouses and you agglomerate it in larger abattoirs, preferably in other countries. Like huge amounts of slaughter takes place before the meat even comes to Britain. But certainly if in British cities, if the abattoir would be hidden on the outskirts of cities, it becomes a kind of production line in reverse. It also enables the use of animal parts to be scaled up and used for things like pharmaceuticals and even intestines for airship gas bags. So it's definitely a very important spatial development. And as you say, it makes food mysterious, which is what Marx talked about with commodities. Commodities having a mysterious, they just appear as if right nowhere. And here is what's happening here is a lump of an animal that's just appeared, wrapped up for me. I'll take it home and cook it. It's actually extraordinarily strange. And so if you want to think about what's the solution to this, maybe the solution is to go back to small planet slaughter.
Yeah.
Is if you want to eat meat, kill it yourself, or have at least someone on the street who does it for you. Stay close to it. You'll eat less meat. You might value more.
Yeah, I mean, I saw a little bit of that in the archives here, actually, in Israel, because when this region was part of the Mandate of Palestine and part of British global economy, they start getting frozen meat. And there are all sorts of conversations about that. Is it kosher? Is it not kosher? Mm-hmm. But really the preference is for meat to be slaughtered locally, not just for culinary reasons, but also for cultural reasons. Part of it is really, you need to slaughter the meat yourself or somebody you trust. And maybe that's another way of imagining the small planet diet. And really the mysteriosity of it is just another way of talking about violence and seeing violence in the food system. We really don't have a lot of time, so I want the last question to be about your next project. So we know that because I'm curious, and I also think that there's a transition here, right? I mean, this book is really a book about how large planet diets change the world. But I see in it part of how we can write history differently. And I mentioned that at the beginning. How can we force different things to be in conversation with one another? How can we write about very long processes, and how can we put the biological and the cultural together? So how did large planet diet change you as a historian? And what about it informed your next book? And is it also going to be a book that I'll read and think, oh, all of it is about violence?
Well, that's a good question. I think that the next book hopefully shouldn't be all about violence. But you never know. How did this book changed me a lot, because in doing it, I moved from being a British historian to doing world history. And that's something that I did through teaching food history and the history of technology, and now a history of health on a kind of global longue durée scale. So in all these courses, I was teaching world food, but I was also teaching food going back to the invention of fire and cooking, and so on, the invention of fire, the taming of fire and cooking, and so on, or technology, and going back to the earliest stone tools. And I read widely around the issue of technology, because I've always been interested in the history of technology, and I came across this concept of the Technosphere about a decade ago, which was emerging. It actually had this interesting history. It was first used in the 60s. It was used in the 70s by some ecologists to talk about how the technosphere was at war with the biosphere and so forth. These two things were incompatible. And then there's been a lot more writing on it in the early 21st century. So I started to think, this is an interesting concept. How can I use this? And I began thinking about it. And I began thinking, well, how does this square with my recent interest in teaching about fire and stone tools? What role did they play? So I was thinking to talk about a technosphere, really, but the technosphere is defined as the sum total of everything humans have built and also have affected. It's a vast and really improbably complex thing to look at. But if you're going to understand it, you're going to have to go back to the origins. And the origins are before Homo sapiens. They're even before the genus Homo. I mean, so I've spent 2 to 3 years working in very deep history. And as I write the book, I've been writing about stone tools, early housing, the history of clothing, all of these sorts of things. And I'm writing it. Another thing that came up writing Diet for a Large Planet was how scale is good to think with, but really complex, because I was talking about very large scale events, very small scale events, and trying to sort of get the connections. And I think that the technosphere, most people who talk about it basically imagine some giant planetary system of sprawling cables and high-tech vehicles and glimmering gigantic skyscrapers. But I kind of became a bit wary that's the technosphere. Or wasn't there a technosphere in 200,000 years ago with the basic tools and houses that people, and very basic from our point of view, houses that people had. People have technology, and also we evolved through technology. I mean, we kind of developed these big brains and suddenly thought, we can make hammers. No, we developed our brains through things like hammers. So this just seemed really interesting to me, and it seemed a way out of the rather depressing presentism of a lot of stuff, including Anthropocene work, where we're talking about our world in peril. Well, maybe we can tell a story that talks about technology in a slightly more sanguine way, as something that has accompanied us throughout our evolution and has enabled us to do remarkable things and enabled us to do dreadful things. We're not going to have a history that's just a declension narrative, because I feel like the food book really was, despite all my best efforts at the end, a depressing read, and it does say that we are in trouble. And I want to try and write a book that doesn't say that, but it probably will be, given my proclivities.
No, I mean, I think that it was interesting that you made the effort at the end of the book to talk about today. It's not always done in history books. And it is, it is still part of what we need to do to go back to optimism. And I think that the story that you're starting to tell about technology is a story about creativity and about becoming who we are. And that would be it does sound like something that includes many other, it will have violence in it, but not necessarily just that. And even, writing about power is not necessarily writing about violence.
Right,
so I think
right.
that you won't be able to write power out of the Technosphere, but I think
No,
that
there'll
violence...
be a whole chapter on power and a whole chapter on how power is always an effect of technological systems and who gets which even down to who has the biggest stone axe. It's sort of, there's ways that we really became very different to any other creatures on the planet, because we can hurt people with big technologies and big systems, which makes our history particularly complex and sometimes depressing.
And on that positive note,
no, I promise this book's going to include lots of fun stuff as well. It's not going to be negative. It's going to be in some ways a celebration of human creativity. But it'll also be an analysis of human depravity at the same time.
Well, I'm so happy that I got to celebrate this book with you today.
Yes.
I'm happy that you wrote it. I think that it does bring forward some questions that we have to unpack, all of us. And I am so happy that people are reading it outside of just historians and
right.
I like that it makes this conversations in the environmental humanities. I like that it brings people interested in food justice into the conversation about food history. And I'm so happy that you joined us today, and I'm so honored to be part of the events that celebrate this book. So thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. This has been tremendous fun, and best of luck with the salon in future. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.